Yes, good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. Apparently we're having some connectivity problems again already this morning, so I beg the pardon of my listeners, and we'll struggle through as best we can, and hopefully we can get some of these technical issues resolved. I wish to continue our reading and discussion of the book The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Remember, we're talking about the expansion of the temporal power of the Pope in the world, that which the Pope counterfeits Christ by calling himself King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And we're talking about the time in history when the Western Roman Empire, when the prophecy of Daniel, I believe is chapter 2, the metal man image, breaks into two iron legs, both east and west, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Eastern Empire, and the Western Empire, the east headed by Constantinople, and the west headed by this vicar of Christ, the so-called replacement of the Son of God on earth. And he ruled over the kings of the Western Empire, and he seated kings and he unseated kings at his pleasure. And it says the sovereigns of the West, that is the kings of the West, who were basically servants of the Pope rather than the people, it says the sovereigns of the West placed armies under their command, meaning under the command of the popes. And they ruined empires, exterminated people in the name of St. Peter, and sent the spoils of the vanquished to increase the wealth of the Roman clergy and to support the monks in idleness and debauchery. Nothing has changed in the world today, by the way, if you are careful and are paying attention to what is going on in the world today. Nothing has changed. The Pope can elicit the armies of nations and also whole blocks of nations to go to war for either the express or the hidden purpose of expanding the Pope's temporal power in the world. And the object of all this increase in temporal power is so that through the civil powers that he conquers, through those nations and governments that he conquers, that he can impose through the civil law his ecclesiastical authority in the world. Nothing has changed. Examine carefully history and also current events, and you will see that nothing has changed. The wars of the world are fought to the great advantage of the papacy, to extend his papal power, his temporal power on the earth. The book continues. It says, influence and power thus acquired were used, of course, for selfish and sinister ends. For men in all ages have been in this respect the same. And it was by popes that the government over the papal states became altogether ecclesiastical. In other words, he gained his temporal power over the papal states, and then he exercised his ecclesiastical authority. They worshipped him as a god, and they were ruled with a rod of iron. The subjects of the papal states were the subjects of the Pope, an unrelenting tyrant. And it says it was conducted entirely by the popes, this government over the papal states, by the assistance of their cardinals and their priests, all of whom were created by the popes and were the mere slaves and creatures of their will. So there you have the government of the papal states, headed up by the popes and administered by his cardinals and his priests. They were the government, both the temporal government, the civil government, and also the ecclesiastical government. And here we have the birth of what Avro Manhattan, in his book, the Vatican Billions, reveals that in every nation, remember, Roman Catholicism is a global religion, and in every nation, the papacy sets up his cardinals and his bishops and divides up the land into dioceses, and that is the form of government that the Pope has in place in every nation. It forms the shadow government of every civil government in the world. and they oversee, guide, and direct the civil power. They bring candidates to the fore, they get them elected, they put Romanists and Papists in positions of power in the country, and eventually completely overthrow the government. And that's precisely what has happened in this country. It's as old as the papacy itself. Wherever you find the temporal power of the Pope, you see political intrigue. And the political intrigue has one aim, and that is to impose the Pope as not only the King of Kings, but the Lord of Lords, to make him worshipped. Now, the people in the Papal States were treated as if born only for the purpose of being ruled and of contributing to the pride and elevation of their rulers. The popular degradation during the Middle Ages contributed to this. And in order that there should be no change in this condition of affairs, and that the people should be kept so ignorant as not to aspire to any higher position, they were either deprived of all opportunity of education, or, if educated at all, it was only in ecclesiastical matters, and under the special direction of the priests, who took good care to see that their first and last lesson was obedience. How would you like to live in an ecclesiastical state? Do you know that every nation in the world, and there's over 100, and I believe 70 at last count, I'll check that figure if it's incorrect, and I'll correct myself. But over 100 nations in this world have signed concordats with the Vatican, therefore, thus making them ecclesiastical states, or on the process of becoming ecclesiastical states, just like the Papal States. Now, it says everything was ecclesiastical, and the power of excommunication, which was held in great dread by the ignorant population. And remember, they dreaded it because it is taught in the Roman Catholic Church that if you're excommunicated from the church, you are excommunicated from heaven. There's no other means to achieve a heavenly home unless you are a card-carrying member and an obedient member of the Roman Catholic Church. That is their teaching, and that is their belief. And excommunication literally means, in the minds of every Catholic that understands the Roman Catholic Church, every excommunication means eternal damnation for those who are excommunicated. So that's why the excommunication was so dreaded. And this threat of excommunication is what made it so easy for the popes to control the kings of the Western European Empire. And it says everything was ecclesiastical. And the power of excommunication, which was held in great dread by the ignorant population, was so perverted from its original meaning and design that it was employed as a means of exacting submission to the papacy in all matters connected with the government, as well as within the church and in the most common and trifling affairs of life. Now, the author gives us some examples of just how trifling this threat of excommunication became, how perverted that it became. He says, quote, this is a quote from a historian, it says, very few of these exertions of the supreme authority of the Vicar of Christ have any bearing on the interest of religion. The political intrigues of the day, the temporal possessions of the church, or the subordination of the hierarchy are in all matters and in all instances the objects of the anathema. How the awful authority over the souls of men was degraded to the level of the pettiest interests is seen when some audacious scoundrels stole the horses of the Pope during his progress through France. He promptly excommunicates the quote-unquote unknown thieves unless the beast shall be returned within 3 days. And he takes advantage of this opportunity to include in the curse some knaves who had previously pilfered his plate while staying at the Abbey of Flavigny. Now listen, if you're in a starving nation And you dare to feed yourself from the plate of the Pope when his back is turned? You might get excommunicated. The Pope's not going to do anything to feed the hungry. He's more worried about expanding his own waistline right along with his temporal power. And so these people who fed off of his plate were excommunicated. And he says, as he shrewdly suspects, with the connivance of the holy monks there. So the monks were in on it. His own monks. And it says that bishops were not disinclined to follow the example of their chief, that is the Pope, and to use their control over salvation for their personal benefit is apparent from the treatment of royalty in Wales about this time. Tudor, king of Brocknock, profanely stole Bishop Libiau's dinner from the Abbey of Lancourt, when the angry prelate excommunicated him and exacted an enormous fine as the price of reconciliation. And when Brockmeal, king of Gwent, and his family were anathematized by Bishop Syphilog for some personal offense, the fee for removing the censure was a plate of pure gold the size of the bishop's face. A power so persistently and so ignobly abused requires something more than merely moral force to ensure respect and obedience, unquote. From Henry C. Lee in his Studies of the Christian Church, page 324. So you see what uncontrolled temporal power, both by the popes and his priests, result. The world has seen it in history. What might we expect if the Roman Catholic Church ever gains that much power, influence, and control in this country or any other nation in this world? Everything was ecclesiastical. The power of excommunication, which was held in great dread by the ignorant population, was so perverted from its original meaning and design that it was employed as a means of exacting submission to the papacy in all matters connected with the government as well as with the church and in the most common and trifling affairs of life. The popes, having achieved success by tempting the ambition of kings and conferring crowns and kingdoms upon them on the condition that they should acknowledge the gift as made in accordance with the divine command, had no difficulty in making an ignorant and superstitious population believe that all the laws they prescribed were equally a part of God's law, that obedience paid to them was obedience to God, and therefore that any act of disobedience would not only deprive them of the protection of the church in this life, but consign them inevitably to eternal tortures in the next. And thus the church and the state were completely united, the state obeying the church. The church, in fact, became the state by holding it in subordination. The people alone were punished. The ecclesiastics, never. They were an exclusive and privileged class. You ever hear people talk about the rich ruling elite? This privileged class that are taking over this country, that are ruining our economy, that are shipping all of our jobs overseas, starving the people, putting the people out of work, bringing down a fascist-style police state, depriving us of our rights and our liberties, and impoverishing us, and threatening us with charges of domestic terrorism if we denounce such things. Do you ever wonder who these rich ruling elite are? These nameless, faceless, rich ruling elite? These nondescript, rich ruling elite? The author has just told us, so did Avro Manhattan so many times in his book. The rich ruling elite of the world are those of the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church and the people in our government and the corporations that they control through this threat of excommunication. It said, in this ecclesiastical state, these papal states, which the popes believe and teach that it is their divine prerogative given to them by God to rule the whole world, and that the whole world should become a papal state. It says the people alone were punished. The ecclesiastics never. Do you ever wonder how a Roman Catholic priest can have multiple abuse, multiple pedophile kids? How a priest can go his whole professional life debauching little boys and not be found guilty in a court of civil law, criminal law in this country, and put away in prison or executed? He said the people alone were punished. The ecclesiastics never. They were an exclusive and privileged class who considered all others as mere, quote, hewers of wood and drawers of water for their superiors, of whom they were the chief. The great and controlling object was to make Rome what she has been in pagan times, the mistress of the world, so that the Pope, as her Pope King, might make and unmake other kings, build up and destroy governments, and thus subject all mankind to his dominion, under the impious and shameless pretense that God had so provided it in his law. That's the papacy. Let me read it again. Understand that it's no myth, this idea that the Pope intends by divine right to rule this world. It says the great and controlling object was to make Rome what she had been in pagan times, the mistress of the world, so that the Pope, as her Pope King, might make and unmake other kings, build up and destroy governments, and thus subject all mankind to his dominion under the impious and shameless pretense that God had so provided in his law. That's the New World Order. And that's why I say it's one of the most prophetic books in my library. This author tells us what the papacy's end is: global conquest, supreme grand master of the whole world. The New World Order. And he tells us precisely how he's going to do it. Showed us in history how it was the old world order came about. It says, and the church and the state were completely united, the state obeying the church. It said the church, in fact, became the state by holding it in subordination. The people alone were punished, and ecclesiastics never. They were an exclusive and privileged class who considered all others as mere hewers of wood and drawers of water for their superiors, of whom they were the chief. The great and controlling object was to make Rome what she has been in pagan times, the mistress of the world, so that the Pope, as her Pope King, might make and unmake other kings, build up and destroy governments, and thus subject all mankind to his dominion, under the impious and shameless pretension that God had so provided in his law. The foundation of the whole structure of government was this: that the Pope was ordained king by Almighty God and ruled by divine authority, and consequently the subject was bound to passive obedience, and not rendering this offended God and committed a sin for which he deserved punishment at the hands of the Roman Catholic Church. This is precisely the kind of government which Pope Pius IX defends in his encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864, and which he prefers to any of those governments constructed after the modern reforms, and especially to that of the United States. It is the kind of government which he requires his followers to defend as a necessary part of their religious faith, And it is this kind of government which his hierarchy in this country would substitute tomorrow if they had the power for the popular institutions under which our nation has grown to its present greatness and distinction. R.W. Thompson has just told us that the Roman Catholic hierarchy and the Roman Catholic people of this country are commanded on pain of excommunication to overthrow our Protestant constitutional republic and replace it with a government that obeys the canon law and makes Roman Catholicism the state-sponsored religion, does away with religious liberty, and imposes the temporal and spiritual power of the papacy upon the people of this nation without fear of overthrow from any quarter. And that means Protestantism must be destroyed. That's the entire object of the New World Order, to destroy Christ's authority among his people and replace it with the authority of Antichrist. We're going to talk about these subjects in this chapter: the Pope's subjects of the Eastern Empire, the 9th century, the Emperor Leo V and Pope Paschal I, image worship, the Church of St. Cecilia in Rome, Louis le Debonair, factions at Rome, Constitution of Lothair, Eugenius II and Valentine, or Valentine, as you might pronounce it, Gregory IV, Sergius, the death of Pope Leo IV, the alleged Popess, Joan. That's right, there was a female pope that has been challenged by many papists, but I believe the evidence is clear, and now many admit that there was indeed a female pope. We're going to talk about Peter's Pence, yes, the precious Peter Pence. We'll talk about that. The East separates from the West, which we've already touched on. Nicholas I claims universal power, his manner of exercising it. Boniface VI poisoned by Stephen the VII. That's right, popes killing popes. They're infallible, you know. And we're going to talk about the trial of a dead pope. That's right, they dig them up if they have to. And it says we're going to talk about the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. Now, when we get to that portion of the chapter, I hope my listeners are paying close attention. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals. Lie upon lie. Lie upon lie. Here a little and there a little is the Roman Catholic Church. And we're going to talk about Victor I and the celebration of Easter. Yes, that was a controversy in the Roman Catholic Church. Polycarp and Anacletus, Irenaeus, the character of the decretals, the papal system based upon them, all false and forged. That's right, it's a counterfeit church, and not a very good counterfeit at that, once reality sinks in. How this church ever became known as a Christian church is just inconceivable. But it's easy if you hide the diabolical history of this Antichrist church, and that's what the Roman Catholic Church is good at, hiding her history and rewriting history in her favor. After all, the winner of every war gets to write its own history, right? The papacy's won a lot of wars. Now we begin with the text. It says, if, as Pope Pius IX and his Jesuit allies affirm, the temporal power of the Pope is included in the spiritual power and has, like it, a divine origin, it must necessarily have a like universality within Christianity itself. It is in this sense that it is claimed to belong to the quote-unquote primacy of Peter and is considered essential to the Pope's ecclesiastical supremacy over the world. Our investigations into its origin and growth, therefore, should be limited only by the means within our reach. Eloquent is R.W. Thompson, but he's clearly telling us that we should use every means at our disposal to study the history of the rise of the papacy and the rise of his temporal and ecclesiastical power in the world. R.W. Thompson is telling us it's one of the most important subjects known to mankind. That's what he has just told us. And I happen to agree, and my regular listeners would certainly agree. You can't understand what is going on in the world today unless you have a good comprehension of what went on in the world yesterday. And that's what we're talking about. Now, speaking of this temporal power of the Pope, it says, if it is in reality divine and necessary, either at Rome or elsewhere, to the existence and dissemination of true religion, and if the liberalism and civilization of society based upon principles in opposition to it are injurious instead of beneficial to mankind, then its legitimacy, with all its attendant authority and consequences, should be conceded in order that the papacy may have supreme jurisdiction over the world and be able to bring all laws and institutions into harmony with its own conceptions of divine will. But if, on the other hand, it has been the result of usurpation, fraud, and imposture, and if the world has been improved and advanced in proportion as it has escaped and separated from its influence, then those who are now so clamorous for its restoration should be held to be unsafe counselors and be dealt with accordingly. But whether it is the one or the other, whether it is to be restored at Rome or in any other part of the world, the study of its history is in every sense instructive, inasmuch as we can in no other way be brought into familiarity with the papacy or comprehend fully the nature and character of the extraordinary pretensions now set up in its behalf. We should not expect good and beneficent results to flow from that which is founded upon fraud and wrong, if it shall appear to have been thus founded. The question is constantly recurring. Why should there have been such delay in the establishment of this tremendous power, if Christ or the apostles designed that belief in its necessity should be made an essential and indispensable part of the system of the Christian faith? Manifestly, they did not so design, or they would have taught it by some word or sign which would have come down to our age by the Scriptures or by the tradition of the apostles. But nothing of this kind has ever reached us by either of those modes. Paul was imprisoned and martyred at Rome by the civil authority, and if Peter was ever there, he met the same fate. The several persecutions through which early Christians passed originated with and were conducted by the same Roman authority. And nowhere in any history of the first centuries is there a single word affirming that either Peter or Paul or any bishop of the Roman or any other church possessed the power of a temporal prince. On the other hand, in those primitive days of the church, the bishops and the clergy devoted themselves to the work given them to do by the Master, capital M, that is Christ, and made it the study and effort of their lives to imitate his example of benevolence, humility, and love. They did not strive for the honors, wealth, or power of this world, after temporal scepters or the crowns of kings, but after the salvation of immortal souls. And yet he who today denies either the lawfulness or necessity of the Pope's temporal power, if he belongs to the Roman Catholic Church, is excommunicated because he violates the true faith. And if he do not, he is denounced, cursed, and anathematized as a heretic. And whole books are written with learning and wonderful ingenuity to prove that Christ's church cannot exist without it. The Pope himself sends forth from his pretended prison this lamentation at its loss of his power, and his followers forthwith combine themselves into a compact and formidable organization, demand assistance from governments, threaten another bloody crusade, and pledge themselves never to remit their efforts until the crown of royalty is again placed upon the papal brow. You see what R.W. Thompson has just described? A Roman Catholic, a united, concerted, and Roman Catholic effort in the name of religion to restore the papacy's temporal power in the world, no matter the cost. He says, we have seen that this power did not exist in any form before the separation of Rome from Constantinople, of the West from the East, and also the effect of this separation upon its acquisition. This brings us to still more solid ground, to the investigation of events which, although not entirely free from difficulty, have a better foundation. Mr. Hallam, who is accepted as undoubted authority on all hands, says this, quote, the popes appear to have possessed some measure of temporal power, even while the city was professedly governed by the exarchs of Ravenna in the name of the Eastern Empire. This power became more extensive after her separation from Constantinople. It was, however, subordinate to the undeniable sovereignty of the new imperial family, who were supposed to enter upon all the rights of their predecessors. There was always an imperial officer or prefect in that city to render criminal justice. An oath of allegiance to the emperor was taken by the people, and upon any irregular election of a pope, a circumstance by no means unusual, the emperors held themselves entitled to interpose. But the spirit and even the institutions of the Romans were republican, unquote. Republican was the Roman government, the legitimate Roman government, not the papacy. The papacy is never a republican government. It is an autocratic dictatorship, a malevolent dictatorship, and it is waged in the name of religion. Now, Archbishop Kenrick is not ingenuous when he quotes the first two sentences of the above extract to show the existence of the temporal power before the separation from Constantinople and its increase, quote, on her separation from Constantinople, unquote. By the omission of all the latter part of what McCallum says, what Mr. Hallam says, he fails to show the, quote, undeniable sovereignty, unquote, of the empire, that an oath of allegiance to it was required, and that the emperor had the right to interfere even in the election of a pope. Why this omission? Manifestly because the whole of what Mr. Hallam says repudiates all idea of any sovereignty except that possessed by the emperor, a concession which even so fair a man as Archbishop Kenrick could not make while held in the toils of the papacy. But his omission is not so bad as his misquotation. For the purpose of making it appear that the immediate effect of the separation of Rome from Constantinople was a great increase in the temporal power of the Pope, with the consent of the King of France, he quotes the second sentence in the above extract from Mr. Hallam thus, quote, this power became more extensive on her separation from Constantinople, unquote. Mr. Hallam did not use this language. The word employed by him is after, not on. Quote, this power became more extensive after her separation from Constantinople, unquote. To say that the result was produced on the separation is equivalent to stating that it followed directly as a consequence. Whereas if it were after that event, The growth may have been slow and gradual, each step the work of usurpation. And this is Mr. Hallam's meaning, which Archbishop Kenrick endeavors to obscure by misquoting him. The 9th century opened under the influence of the new order of things. For 800 years, Christianity had existed in the world and had grown, strengthened, and prospered under the guardianship of bishops and priests who had no jurisdiction over temporal affairs. Even the bishops of Rome, with all their pride and ambition, had been limited in their authority to spiritual affairs, and the occasional claims they set up for an enlargement of their powers served only to show them that no such enlargement could ever be obtained with the consent of the people, and that if obtained at all, it must be the result of combination with princes, a conspiracy against the popular government. R.W. Thompson has just told us that the extension of the temporal power of the Pope would never be accepted by the people generally. And this is true. And this is exactly why Rome has always had to use the civil authority to get control of the kings, to get control of the courts, to get control of the congresses, to impose this temporal power through the civil law. Mankind does not naturally desire the temporal, or, and I will boldly add, or the ecclesiastical authority of the Pope. It must be imposed, and it is imposed by the civil power. Together, the Roman Catholic Church and the governments over which it rules is typified in the Bible by the woman who rides the scarlet-colored beast. Together, they are an unbeatable foe until Christ comes and destroys it. This is how the beast operates. It's a woman, a church, controlling a beast. The beast is an oppressive civil government that is imposing the church's will or the Pope's will over the people. Now understand Revelation chapter 17 when you read it in this context. This context is valid. It was the belief of all the Protestant reformers. And early Protestantism understood this concept of the woman riding the beast and how it existed in the world through the papacy and all the kings and governments of the world over which he ruled. This is what has been lost in our knowledge in the Protestant world. It has to be restored. If there's any hope at all that we might save this once constitutional republic from this union of church and state that is destroying it. He always had to resort to the use and combination with the princes of the world to accomplish this conspiracy, a conspiracy against popular government. And remember, when you hear the term popular government, immediately that should arise in your mind is a government of, by, and for the people. That's what makes it popular. That's the form of government that the people want, a government that's of, by, and for the people. But the Pope says no. The people are not to govern. They are to be governed. And I, the Pope, the vicar of Christ, am the governor of the world by divine right. You see how this works? He says they well knew that it would be impossible to acquire the possession of unlimited power in Rome without the accomplishment of these two things: successful revolt against the Eastern empires, against the Eastern emperors, and the destruction of the Roman Republic. The Pope has to destroy all republics. That's why Pope Pius IX wrote his encyclical and syllabus of error, condemning all republics. Republics are constitutional forms of government that protect the voice of the people. And the premier republic of that time was the United States of America. And the encyclical and syllabus of error was written and designed to anathematize this republic in the United States. And the papacy from that time forward and before set its sights on bringing down this constitutional republic, this government of, by, and for the people, to replace it by hook or by crook. And I use that term specifically, by hook or by crook, by the papal staff, to impose a malevolent papal dictatorship. And that's where we're headed in this country. The achievement of the first, that is, the revolt against the Eastern emperors, gave the popes the means of bringing about the last result, that is, the destruction of the Roman Republic. So that's how the Roman Republic fell, and it was replaced by a papal dictatorship. That's the Dark Ages. That's the medieval ages, when the popes ruled supreme. They first had to conquer the East. He who now restrains will restrain until he's taken out of the way. It wasn't enough for the Pope that he just beat feet for Byzantium and set up shop and renamed the place Constantinople. No, he had to rule over the East. And that's how it took place in history. Now, the immediate consequence of the protection given to the popes by the French monarchs was the exercise of tyrannical authority over the inferior bishops and clergy, the object being to make the single will of the Pope the governing authority of the Church, not only in Rome, but all over the Christian world. Notwithstanding the recognized independence of the several churches during the apostolic times, and for centuries afterward, the unity of faith which had been preserved by the diversities of local government, papal ambition soon became so all-absorbing as to see no other motive in the management of church affairs but its own gratification. Cormenin, referring to the change thus produced by religion, says, quote, hang on a second. All right, continue with Cormenin's quote. He says, quote, holy traditions were despised. The morality of Christ was outraged. The orthodoxy of the Church no longer consisted in anything but the sovereignty of the Pope, the adoration of images, and the invocation of saints in sacred singing, the solemnity of masses and the pomps and ceremonies, in the consecration of temples, splendid churches, monastic vows, and pilgrimages. He continues, Rome imposed its fanaticism and its superstitions on all the other churches. Morality, faith, and true piety were replaced by cupidity, ambition, and luxury. The ignorance of the clergy was so profound that a knowledge of the singing of the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the service of the Mass was all that was demanded from princes and ecclesiastical dignitaries. Unquote. Paschal I became Pope in the year 817, and Leo V, the Emperor of the East, and Theodore, Patriarch of Constantinople, sent nuncios to him with the view of reconciling the disagreement between the Eastern and Western Christians, and I would rather say Catholics, in reference to the worship of images. Now remember, Christians have never worshipped images and idols. When you begin to worship images and idols, you no longer fit the definition of a Christian. You've become a pagan. But there was a great controversy, the war of the iconoclasts between the Eastern and Western Roman Church. People will cringe when I say that, but it's still the same church. But there's this apparent conflict between the East and the West over the veneration of images and idols and angel worship and all that stuff. And so the East sent nuncios to the Pope to somehow reconcile this difference over the worship of images and idols. In other words, make some kind of compromise over their paganism. But the Pope, fearing that a reconciliation of this kind would lead to the impairment of his papal influence and put an end to the alliance with France, and caring far more for his own temporal power than for the restoration of harmony in the church, refused to receive the nuncios or even hear any suggestion of the compromise. He drove them out of Rome in disgrace and relied upon the protection of the King of France, and he had the impudence soon after to send legates to Constantinople and command